Hi, everyone. This is Kevin Johnson with the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association. Appreciate everybody joining us today. We usually do a spring and fall webinar on nitrogen management going into the spring, but also going in the fall fertilizer season. Today, we have Dr. John Jones with the University of Illinois. He is new to the University of Illinois, but he's not he's an old friend to the industry. He's worked for the Fertilizer Institute and others talking about nitrogen management. So we're going to turn it right over to Dr. Jones and to talk about going into the 2025 crop and what we're looking at for nutrient management. Dr. Jones, appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks, KJ. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed my seven months so far in Illinois, and it's been fun to get around the state and really interact with growers and agronomists as we build out the soil fertility research program here in my lab. So today I'll be covering a few different considerations for nitrogen and a few other nutrients going into 2025, looking at some scenarios of where we're at in terms of precipitation, soil moisture, and then some data that I think is useful as we make decisions, even though we've got quite a bit of field activity that's been going on the last few weeks, depending on where you're at and how much moisture you received in the last day or so. I think one of the things that's been pretty clear and kind of around the north central region, but certainly when I talk with growers around Illinois, is we have these relatively consistent temperature and moisture swings that are happening in spring and fall that may be following what's been expected over the past 30 years and maybe not, maybe becoming a little more extreme. One of the challenges with that is certainly when we think about soil sampling in the fall anhydrous applications, and physical application effectiveness within a given soil condition. But in general, those swings might allow us to have some kind of predictability of what management considerations we need to take into effect. When we look across the state in general, going in around harvest time, things were a little bit drier, but depending on where you were at around the state after that, there was about a 3-week window where there was considerable moisture. One of the things that I think most talked about at winter meetings this year was the amount of snowfall and snow cover for a long time in the southern part of the state compared to the central and northern part. As an add-on, I was at a meeting in Ontario, Canada in January, and we actually had quite a bit more snow cover around Effingham than Ontario did, in the southern part of the province. So really some adequate, at least, winter soil moisture coming into the southern part of the state, although when we move north, we're probably in a little drier conditions, although we have had some precipitation in the last few days that hopefully can make up for that. One of the things that I think is important to consider when we talk about fall applications of N, but even moving into spring planting season and spring applications of N, whether it be in an early anhydrous application or moving into a more drier liquid form, is that we really don't know how these pulses of warm soil and moisture affect nitrification in the fall, again, as I mentioned, or the spring. We certainly had those within the fall of 2024, thinking about on when we were able to get anhydrous rigs out in soil conditions at that time. Generally, we like to think about a sustained soil temperature being a threshold of safe application to reduce losses potentially and keep N there in an ammonium form as long as we can, and then eventually it'll get converted to nitrate in the spring and available for crop uptake, for corn uptake. However, one thing that we do see are these pulses of moisture and temperature that really we need to get a good handle on. And we're doing some research to look at that in the lab and crafting some projects that are going to be answering those specific questions, because in general, we see that an inconsistent temperature threshold, I'll say, that maintains in certain parts of the late fall or into the early spring. An example is shown here. On the left, you're seeing the departure of the average air temperature in February to March of this year. Certainly, we can see that in general there was a warmer trend than usual. In the middle graph or middle map, you're seeing an expected date of sustained soil temperature above 50 degrees in the fall, or excuse me, in the spring. And on the right, you'll see the March 22nd, or a few days ago, 4-inch bare soil temperature across the state of Illinois. And we saw similar maps in the fall where we were seeing these pulses of warm conditions. Depending on how deep these temperature values are going or how deep the soil is warming, these can probably affect some changes from one end form to another that could lead to losses or changes in availability and thus fertilizer nitrogen requirement as well. So I'll get into a few results from trials of last year and give a little bit of a summary. One of the things that I really want to talk about are some changes that we've done myself and been working with Dr. Nafsinger on looking at the historical database and what makes sense to kind of use as guidelines going forward within more the year aspect of when the trials were conducted. This is an example, and if you've heard me talk in winter meetings this winter, you've probably seen this figure a few times. I'll go through some corn yield response to nitrogen trials in the central northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. Of these trials that you see on the screen here, what you're looking at are corn yield response to nitrogen rate. The yellow triangles were the optimum N rate or where the maximum return to nitrogen occurred. And the green circles are at this point in time, so including 2023 data, where the optimum nitrogen rate would be located at, or where it was at that point. You can see that we certainly have that spread that even though our green dots really kind of center around those yellow triangles, certainly we have a spread where we did see some sites and conditions where quite a bit more nitrogen fertilizer was needed to overcome the lack of soil supply. And I think when you think about 2024 growing season, there were some fairly significant lapses in soil moisture and in temperature, and probably in combination with whenever your planting date occurred, that you're dealing with some really temporally different peak and uptake timings or soil and supply timings. And so I think that really started to integrate into what we saw with responses to N across the northern and central parts of the state. And these are the data from Southern Illinois. So these were coordinated by John Pike in the southern part of the state. Again, the same type of figure where the yellow triangles are the optimum N rate and the green circles would be the recommended nitrogen rate pre-2024, for example. That was around 200 pounds of N across about 154 trials around the southern part of the state. In 2024, the optimum N rates for the southern part of the state ranged from around 157 to 206 pounds of N. So really bracketed, and we're a little bit lower than that pre-2024 data was guiding us at. The yield at those optimum N rates certainly was really wide when we think about around 185 to 250 bushels per acre at that optimum N rate. You can see that there on the graph. Overall, it was a year with a lot of relatively clean responses to nitrogen and clear trends, things that made sense when we were thinking about the rate of yield increase as incremental N rates were applied. One thing that's important, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is that we do see certainly a higher end demand in the southern part of the state, and really that's driven by the slope on the left side of these curves that we're looking at. For example, if we look at the curves in northern and central Illinois, the aspect's a little bit different on these slides. We can see that slope is a lot more steep in the lower N rates in the southern part of the state, really just showing that our end demand really has a high velocity, so to speak, and increases up to where we're meeting the end demand of the corn crop. And that's a little bit something important we'll talk about later. Something that's been done for a few years with Dr. Nafsinger and Dan Schaefer and John Piker out of the state has been looking at 2 N rate strip trials or 2 rate treatments as kind of a verification for what their optimum N rate was around that part of the state. You can see that there were 6 trials done last year, 3 in the central part and 3 in the southern part. In general, that moderate or that default optimum N rate was around 190 pounds, and the higher rate was closer to 230, although that varied by site. But in general, what you're seeing are yield and response, economic return to nitrogen response to that higher N rate that was applied compared to the default. And you can see that certainly we have some noise in the data overall, except for the Central Illinois site 3 in the middle there. We really saw a yield increase with that higher N rate and sometimes an increase in economic response to nitrogen, but not all the time. So for the site farthest to the left, there was a very strong yield and economic response to that higher N rate. that matches around that area of the state what we saw in terms of N rate responses. They were a lot higher than what we'd seen previously, probably due to some reduced soil organic nitrogen mineralization rates, mostly due to soil temperature and moisture, probably moisture more than anything. As we move from left to right, you can see that yield responses were lower than 10 bushels in most cases, with that higher N rate compared to what the default MRTN rate would suggest. In the middle site and the third site in central Illinois, there was really a negligible yield increase, and so a reduction of $19 per acre in terms of economic response to N. That's at $0.50 per pound of N and $4.25 corn price. On average, usually there was about a 6.4 bushel increase for that higher N rate, and again about corresponding about $6 per acre increase in the response to N. And so what these trials are allowing the farmers that are engaging in these and conducting these is to do a little bit of honing in on management for specific fields, specific strips within the field. Now let's take a step back one more year. This is in 2023. Nitrogen rate trials on the central part of the state on the left and southern part on the right. And you can see it's a little bit of a similar story to what we saw in 2024 as well, especially when we look at the southern part of Illinois. But if we look at central Illinois on the left side, we saw some quite impressive yield levels with relatively low optimum N rates. When we think about how the curves of these yield responses interact, though, we saw quite a steep curve in 2023 in many central Illinois sites that we really didn't see in 2024. But really, I think there was a perfect storm depending on when your planting date and then subsequent soil and mineralization rates were happening. If you looked at the average optimum within this part of the state for 2023 trials, it was around 178 pounds of N per acre. That was right at around 260 bushels per acre. In the southern part of the state, again, kind of a similar story that we saw in 2023, where you've got a bracket around that about 200 pounds of N at the MRTN rate. But there were quite a few sites that were lower than that 200-pound rate. So but again, these slopes of the curves when we're at the low N rates are quite a bit higher than what we see in the central part of the state. That's pretty important. So I'll go into a little bit of details about what's going on in terms of looking at updating N rate guidance around the state, or at least refining what we're using for data to communicate what we're seeing for optimum N rates that are observed in the research around the state. We are still updating the corn N rate calculator. So I'm working with PAQ Interactive and collaborators around the North Central region. And actually, I think this week we'll be able to update the website. We're changing some of the underlying data that's going into some of the guidelines. And Dr. Nafsinger and I have been working the last few months really piecing apart specific sites, soils, conditions, yield levels, and I think that has a lot of value, and I'll show that in a few subsequent slides. But the website is being updated currently to include 2023 to 2024 trial data as the recommended rates and guidelines for Illinois that are present on the website. Again, the website allows you to input your region, previous crop, nitrogen price and corn price, and then interpret the yield response data that we share as a function of the tool. And an example here on the right, many of you may have seen these types of slides and screenshots before. This is just an example from Southern Illinois, and again, this only has trial data up to 2023, and we've shifted the database a little bit to incorporate really a more recent time period, so to speak. So a few questions that I hope to answer in the next few slides are, as we update and refine and guidance, there's, I think, I kind of tried to think of FAQs or frequently asked questions that would come as a result of going through these exercises. And the first one that has seemed to come up quite a bit this winter is, do the yield levels, historic or our target yield levels, have relevance? We know that increasing yield does equate to larger total nitrogen demand of corn crops, especially in above ground biomass. But that doesn't always equate to higher fertilizer nitrogen rates that need to apply to optimize yield, especially optimize to an economic optimum N rate. And so that soil supply is the unknown that we need to really get a good handle on, and we're addressing that to some degree in the research projects that we're putting together within the lab across the state of Illinois. Again, and another question, what's the finest scale that we can really achieve a realistic expectation of predicting corn yield response to nitrogen fertilizer? We have 3 regions across the state. Do we need to separate things in a crop reporting district, county, soil association, or soil family level? Looking at timber, prairie soils, and trying to break apart the state like that. That's really an exercise that we're going through right now. So certainly always interested in input from the agronomic community around the state, how we can do that. I think we're crafting a pretty strong team that's going to be able to answer some questions with some really rigorous field research around the state. And then can we separate out different nitrogen sources, timings, placement strategies, tillage systems, or cover crops? Some of those components are more consistently different. For example, fall versus spring. If we do a complete fall spring nitrogen rate compared to a spring nitrogen, or a fall versus a spring nitrogen rate, generally we see a little bit more consistent differences in our optimum N rates, not necessarily our yield levels. But when we start to compare things like split plantings between a planting in V6 application compared to a planting in V8, we see the water be a little more muddy in terms of finding a clear interpretation that we can say, if you're using this exact split, this would be the optimum N rate to apply. That becomes a little more challenging just because of the fluctuations in crop end demand within the growing season and soil supply as well. But I will say with a well-structured and represented field research program, we can get close to many of these refinement goals, and really collaborative efforts will help put that forward. So let's start kind of take a step back and look at some of the data and breaking apart into yield levels, for example. So answering one of those first questions. What I'll start to share is the information broken apart into different time ranges, and then eventually I'll share kind of what we arrived at for a new interpretation of the optimum N rates and N rate trial databases across Illinois. So this is data from 2013 to 2024. So again, we kind of chunked it into the last 11 years, essentially, of when research was done. There was previously research in the database from 2006 to 2022 and 2023. What we did here was break apart the yield level, or the yield at the optimum N rate within the database. So we started to segment it out by 25 pound increments. And we looked at the optimum N rate for those given sites. So we can see on moving from left to right, we have a lower up to a higher observed yield level within the field research, right? This is not a target yield level. This is measured data. This is not modeled data. It's measured yield in terms of bushels per acre that was coming out of the field at the optimum N rate. When we piece this apart, then we really don't see a discernible trend, let's say an increasing optimum fertilizer N rate as yield increases. And I'm guessing if you've attended a talk from Dr. Nafsinger's in the past, you probably see a scatter plot, and I have one here I'll show you as well, showing that the yield at optimum N rate does not have a relationship with the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate that's observed at that yield level. You can see the orange points are the number of trials within these yield levels. So you can see we certainly have quite a few within the 225 to 250, bordering on the 225 ranges, but certainly we do have quite a spread here when we're looking at the information across yield levels. And I think this is important because a lot of the times we think that plant has to be functioning at a different rate or a different capacity in terms of plant nutrition at different yield levels. And there's some velocity of nutrient uptake, timings, and things like that do come into play. But one of the things that we really have to be quite frank about is just the variability of the soil supply of nutrients. How do we measure that better? This would be the total uptake of supplied by the soil. So we're looking at that same data, and what this is showing is the soil portion or soil supplied total nitrogen uptake, or yield, you can consider this as well, for each of these segments of yield levels across the data setting in 2013 to 2020. And this is across all Illinois and previous crops as well. So we could pull this apart, but I just wanted to show a general trend across the state. And so when we look at this, it's a very similar pattern, for example. We don't necessarily see higher yielding environments have a higher amount of soil supplied nitrogen or amount the total nitrogen that was supplied by the soil. In fact, even in these low yielding environments, we can get over 75%. If you go in the upper left-hand corner of this graph, over 75% of the total N supplied at the optimum N rate was from the soil. And we know that because we have low nitrogen rates or zero check rates, that we can take the difference of those values. And one of the important things is these are not static plots. These are on-farm trials that in 2 years previous had a blanket nitrogen rate applied as a production system. So they're not static plots where we're saying there's a continuing effect of a nitrogen rate applied to the same space. And so what this really shows is the soil supply amount of soil supply nitrogen is really variable. Can we get a better handle on that? Possibly with some general assumptions, and we have to accept some variability that we're comfortable with as well. Now we're going to look at things in a little bit of different light. So I'm going to go back to kind of the larger data set and compare things from 2006 all the way up to 2024. So what this is showing is the yield at the optimum N rate from 2006 to 2024. The box plots in general, the lines show the median value of, I coded it to show the median value of the optimum N rate for a given year. The box and whiskers usually show a 25 to 75th percentile, and then there's some outliers you'll see in points as well. 2010 is kind of an odd year. Everything was really squished together. But in general, we do see an increasing trend. It's a little cyclical though, right? So you can see kind of an increase up to 2009. Then we have the 11, 12, and 13 years. The increase to 2018. 2019, I know, was a year that was challenging as well. 15 was wet and challenging as well. And then we kind of see a normalization up to an increasing trend again. Now, a lot of times if you fit all of this data onto one graph and fit a line across it, you can say that we do have increasing N rates over time. But it's important to know that there's a lot of confounding variables within the data set as well. Different sites per year, different management, depending on where the trials were done, different parts of the state. And I'm just showing, this is central and northern Illinois, and I'll show southern Illinois in the next slide. But what I think is really important is what we started to do when looking across this data set was say, what years does it make sense to maybe start dropping some of the older data? Mostly because of maybe those production practices aren't as relevant as they are today. Or simply the yield levels just aren't, and they reflect older hybrids, older management systems as well. And what we ended up doing was kind of putting a timestamp, especially considering the drought effects and effects on yield in response to the data in 2012. We decided to put a line right between 2012 and 2013 and say everything prior to 2013 we were going to drop from the data set. And the reason we did that is to kind of keep this 10 or 11 year moving average. It's not really an average, but moving time period that we're referencing. We know that what happened in the previous few years certainly has some indication of what potentially could happen next year. It's not always a great prediction. But as we start to get into an ability to expect what we see with the power of a large data set, this is what we ended up doing. So putting a break between 2012 and 2013 and looking at the data in the last 11 years as the data that we can use to guide what we do moving forward. This is the data for Southern Illinois, so 2006 to 2024 as well. And you can see that we probably see that increasing trend a little more consistently because of some years that were had up and downs or a little more variable information or data. Certainly we do have fewer sites within the southern part of the state compared to central and northern Illinois. But the last few years actually within the data set, there's been almost equivalent amount of data coming from the southern part of the state as the central part of the state as well. And so as we kind of took a similar approach at around this will be in 2014 for Southern Illinois. But essentially in 2014 going forward, that's the data that we're going to be using to interpret an optimum N rate for that part of the state, or the southern part of the state. Yeah, and this is all corn following soybean that we looked at. I'll go into a little discussion around continuous corn in a second here. But this is kind of what we saw as an indicator that it made sense to shift where the data was coming from that we want to interpret an optimum N rate across the state for different regions. And certainly this is the graph that I was referencing you probably expect. This would be the data from 2013 to 24. This is all Illinois trials. As you've probably seen on the left, there's not a relationship between yield at the optimum N rate and the optimum fertilizer N rate. And then as we look on the right, now the yield at zero nitrogen, or where our low N rates were applied, we certainly do as we move to the right, and there's more, essentially where the soil is able to support a higher yield on its own, we see a lower optimum fertilizer rate. Not really surprising. Now, it's not really that strong of a relationship, and it's not even, I would say, worth putting equations on there to describe the trend. It's certainly a decreasing trend in general, but it's just one thing to make sure to keep in the consideration that even though even the yield with 0N does have a relationship with optimum fertilizer rate, it's not really that strong. And so there's other ways that we might need to normalize the data. When we think about timings, so I talked about how yield level was maybe a concern, the different considerations for I'll say 4R practices outside of rate. Obviously, we're always assessing rate. But certainly when we think about the fertilization component of timing, there are things that are maybe make a little more sense. So one of the things that we can consider is a full fall versus spring nitrogen application. Now the amount of acres receiving a full nitrogen application for the intended corn crop in the fall are decreasing over time. But if we are comparing specifically using anhydrous as a source and comparing the two timings, this is some data that Dan Schaefer and Dr. Nafziger collected from 2013 to 2020. This is part of one of my master's students' thesis that he's writing up. And essentially, we really don't see a difference in yield level at the optimum. You can see the numbers here on the bottom part of the screen. What we do see is a pretty consistent 20 to 25, 18 to 20 pound reduction in optimum N rate with spring anhydrous applications compared to fall. Now, the spring timings for this data set, they vary a little bit up to weeks before and 3 to 4 weeks before planting, all the way into a few kind of pre-side dress timings where the corn is about V2 or V3. But in general, that spring timing fairly consistently across the data set led to a lower optimum N rate. And so this is something that's a lot more consistent than, for example, if we compare timings between planting in V6 and V8 and V12, for example, then things just get a little more muddy and tough to predict. So this is the only our 4R component that I'll talk about here. There's some timing and placement research that's going on that we'll be able to summarize a little bit later, and then we're starting to get the idea around of some longer term 4R research studies that are really looking at source, rate, timing, and placement consistently over years across the state, and then we can say what's happening within a given weather condition. So that's something that we're working on right now. So what I'll arrive at here in terms of the nitrogen recommendations or guidelines. So this is the data from 2013 to 2024 supporting the tables and numbers that you're seeing here, showing a corn price of $4.50 and an anhydrous price. Let's say we're considering, or if we already got spring anhydrous out, or you may be side dressing with the anhydrous and the UAN 32 prices. Certainly we can adjust these for UAN 28. What this is showing are the regions of the state, as you would expect, previous crop or crop rotation. And these numbers in general, and I'll get into the differences in a little bit, what you're seeing are probably a little bit higher than what you've seen in the past few years. And that really reflects dropping some of the lower optimum N rates that were present within the older data. Now there's some peer-reviewed research that's come out recently looking at how estimations of optimum N rates are increasing over time in the central corn belt and western corn belt. And we see this kind of as a function of I would say these timestamps of production systems where we are improving, hybrids are improving, our planting technology and efficacy of field operations is improving to a certain extent. And we know, as we already mentioned, high yielding levels do require more total N. The question is if that soil is going to make up for the difference or the fertilizer is going to make up for the difference. And what we've seen really, and when we kind of I wouldn't say modernize, but put the data set into a more recent time frame, we do see higher N rates recommended within different parts of the state. The southern part of the state, I would say, was a little more consistent, even with dropping some of the older data. But specifically in northern and central Illinois, those optimum N rates did increase when only looking at the last 11 years of data. So if you look at around current anhydrous price, as we move, for example, corn following soybean from north, central, and southern, 189, 186, and 207. Now, one thing I think that's important to know is you see the numbers for corn following soybeans in northern Illinois a little bit higher or close to what you see in central Illinois. And that I think is really a function of how the data sets are coming out in terms of looking at more recent information. When we think about the gradient of soil and growing conditions from, let's say, Champaign as we head to the central, north central part of Illinois, that gradient is a lot more, I would say, slow and gradual than compared to when we start to go south on 57, for example. And I think that really makes sense when we see how the data splits out in different parts of the state. Now, this is a north to south gradient that we're only looking at. I think eventually we're going to be looking at things east of the river, west of the river, Illinois River, and getting into specific soils and conditions. But how we're breaking apart the data and information right now is what you're seeing on the screen. And as you'd expect when we look at different pricing scenarios, our optimum N rates where we're delivering the highest economic return to N is showing up to be representative of that. In general, the profitable ranges at these MRTN rates are within 12 to 14 pounds, and I'll show those in the next slide here. One of the things that's important to note from this table is that we did end up dropping the continuous corn interpretation for Southern Illinois. In general, that was not changing and that different from our corn following soybean. And at least from discussions with farmers and agronomists around the southern part of the state, we didn't make sense to include that interpretation anymore. There actually hasn't been any continuous corn research done to support any updated recommendations for a while now. And so I think that made quite a bit of sense in terms of what cropping system practices are doing. We are looking at some different rotational effects of double crop wheat and soybeans, how that compares to full season soybeans previous to the corn crop, and that research is ongoing right now. Here we look at the ranges. So again, this is maybe a figure you're familiar with seeing. This is at the 1 to 10 N to corn price for that 2013 to 2024 data set again. And this is where you see that optimum N rate for the north, central, and southern part of the state. They did go up compared to previous numbers. So we can see those ranges again, 177 to 204 in the northern part, 174 to 201 in central, and 196 to 223 in the southern part of the state. The blue boxes with the white text are that calculated maximum return to N rate. And then these ranges are profitable ranges that are defined within $1 per acre economic response to N for these optimum rates. This is really the change that you'd see compared to, we'll say, considering 2023 and earlier data, or 2022 and earlier data that went back to 2006. So a relatively larger increase in optimum N rate in the northern part of the state. Central part of Illinois, I would say a little more of a gradual increase. We have to remember that these things are a little bit weighted for the amount of trials that are done in each part of the state as well. I think this is really important. That's why we're trying to really ramp up on-farm research production around Illinois to represent the soils and climates and systems that we have in the state. And in the southern part of the state, we saw a 9-pound increase. And again, these aren't necessarily. This is a change of when we're dropping quite a bit of data information from 2006 to 2012. And so these changes may seem drastic at first, but really when we start to think about production systems, yield levels, farming practices within that time frame, I think this makes a lot of sense when we think about this. I didn't even have my driver's license when I was when in 2006 when we were in that early part of the data set. So I think there's just some transitions that make a lot of sense when we think about how this data set, we're updating it throughout time. The corn on corn data really has little change, and so there's probably not a whole lot of fluctuation compared to some of the earlier data that you would have seen. And again, we really don't think there was a lot of value in providing this continuous corn data for Southern Illinois, mostly because there hadn't been trials, and so it really wasn't been reflective of the same time frames as the other data set. what we probably recommend is really looking at that corn following soybean optimum N rate if you do have corn crops following each other. And then we can maybe adjust a little bit depending on soils, growing conditions, years of corn, if it is corn following corn. If you're just skipping 1 year in the rotation and putting corn following corn, that's a little bit different than if you're more continuous rotation. But it's something to consider, and would certainly enjoy feedback if that's the case. Those take some questions. So we've kind of wrapped up on the end side, and I want to talk a little bit about phosphorus and potassium going into this year, especially with considerations around grain prices, fertilizer dry fertilizer P&K availability and prices. I know I've gotten contacted by quite a few journalists interested in the importance of potassium for Illinois farmers, and so I think this is something that's important to hit on and consider as well. These are really just some highlights that I think are important, and I'll show some data here in a second about what to consider going into 2025. Granted, you're probably thinking about the fall application season of 2025 at this point, but some things that I think are really important to consider. So how soil tests reports are interpreted, or how soil test data is interpreted, really shouldn't change as prices become unfavorable. A low testing soil is still going to inhibit yield. A high testing soil is still going to likely not respond to fertilization. What I think really this is a good point is to critically assess where your very high to very high testing fields are, and you can allow for some cost savings or shift application priority at least to those soils that are low testing, or maybe you haven't sampled in a while and you know your yields have been very strong and your removal has been very high. Wherever your soil tests are at, the really goal is to have an ROI to fertilization for P and K individually, and then as a fertilizer management strategy. That's no matter if you're at low testing sites or high testing sites. We want to maximize that ROI, and the bulk of that is done by looking at yield response. But then we take price considerations into account for rates. Knowing your levels from the last sampling and realistic removals make a lot of sense if you're within the maintenance range. And I would caution to be a little bit careful if you're interpreting, let's say, 2020 and 2022 data. Those were fairly dry fall conditions. So maybe reflect back on whether your agronomist or yourself were taking soil samples, what the conditions were like at that time. Were they different than the previous years than you would have expected? We're kind of in a time frame where we have a lot of dry sampling conditions, and so we need to take that into consideration when interpreting P&K data. And this is just an example of how looking at this in a long-term aspect is really important. But it's also, I think, hits the case that soil sampling ROI generally does increase when margins get tight, because we can pick out those areas of the field or whole fields that really we can either cost save on or make sure that we prioritize so we're not losing yield. And so I think this is where this is really important. What this figure shows is the relationship between decreasing soil test K on the left to cumulative removal of potassium on the right. In general, within this trend, there is about 10 pounds of K2O removed per part per million of K that was dropped in the soil, and 5 pounds of K per pound. Excuse me, that should be per pound. 5 pounds of K2O removed per pound of soil K. All right, so that would have been a 10 relationship for parts per million, 5 per pound of K. And one of the things that I think it's important to look at is if you were soil sampling at a given year, let's say year 5 or year 7 or year 9, that trend may not always be very clear, right? So the dots are where your measured soil test level was. For example, in year 5, we had a very low testing condition for the soil. And then we saw that spike up again in year 6. And so these certainly aren't perfect linear trends, although the removal is, because we can calculate that. One of the things that I like to show that I think is really important, and this is kind of the inverse of a yield response to fertilization curve or soil test level curve, is considering price conditions when we're interpreting soil test levels. And I'll kind of show why I think it doesn't make sense to change what you consider as a very high testing soil with price considerations, but instead adjust your rate determination. So this is an example with phosphorus. There's corn and soybeans here, and what you're looking at is a different price condition moving from the left to right. Granted, we're somewhere around that, somewhere between this left and central pane of the figure here, more towards the left though when we look at these corn and soybean prices. And essentially what we're looking at here is the break-even point. This is the net return to phosphorus fertilization for these given ranges, and where we're essentially not seeing a return to phosphorus fertilization anymore. And in general, those numbers, they do shift a little bit, but not a lot when we think about these price changes within grain, right? So 25 to 31 parts per million, that could be a sampling error very easily, or a sample that was essentially taken at half an inch too shallow of a depth. There's certainly some interlab variability that occurs, but within general, I would consider that not important to think about right now, but really looking at how these change over time. Again, looking at that break-even point, very similar to what we think about within that maintenance or upper range of the maintenance category. Okay. Now we can also look at considerations for changing fertilizer prices. So if we keep the corn and soybean prices static here, consistent, we look at around prices of around $600 per ton of DAP on the left, around 782 dollars per ton of DAP on the right. And you can see that then we see quite a bit of shift a little bit when we start to look at interpretations. But really we stay fairly close to this condition on the right here. And that's really, I think, where we need to be. And this matches what we're looking at for an optimum range for soil test P as well. We can do the same exercise for K, and we really see the same kind of relationship here. When we look at very slight shifts within the interpretation of a soil test level relative to grain prices, moving from 143 all the way up to 154 from a low grain price to a higher grain price. What's nice, again, is these break-even points really match what we see in yield response to fertilization and how we interpret soil test levels. And we can do the same scenario again where we look at changing fertilizer prices. And this is why, because the effect of fertilizer price may affect these responses and the amount of partial profit essentially from a K application, it makes sense to adjust your rates instead of how you interpret a soil test level. Just a reminder that these are the grain removal numbers that were published in 2017 from a 3-year study, and we're looking at not necessarily updating these, but how to confirm these annually. I know there's certain agronomists that are out there taking grain samples and making removal maps, and I think that's a valuable exercise to really look at those grain concentration numbers that you're seeing in the field. One thing I would just stress is that you're always back calculating or adjusting for moisture when doing that, because most times the grain concentration is reported in dry weight from labs unless they're back calculating as well. So something that's important to consider. But if you're within that maintenance range, these are numbers that will be useful for developing your fertilizer plan for the fall. One thing that I'll hit on just a little bit on potassium. I know we talked about nitrogen most of the talk, but I'll hit on these as well just because I think there's some interesting conditions that we see, and I talk about these kind of fluctuations of soil moisture that are affecting everything from nitrification all the way to what your soil test K says. This is a figure to show, this was an exercise we did looking at oven drying time and the amount of K measured in a soil test. So we know soil moisture and it really affects available potassium. Potassium probably acts a little bit more like nitrogen than we give it credit for in terms of its mobility in the soil, mostly not necessarily due to mass flow, but just because of the strong influence of soil moisture on the availability and location of where K is around specific minerals and within the soil solution. What this exercise showed is that as we essentially left soil within the dryer and then analyzed it, we were increasing the amount of potassium that was measured within that soil. This is a Plano silt loam 6-inch sample that was pulled. This is from some data from my time when I was doing soil fertility research up in Wisconsin. And essentially you can see that if we extracted that soil test at a field moist condition, it was around 138 parts per million of K. As we increased the drying time, we increased at least to a point where it did kind of level off. But if our drying time was significantly different between 0 and let's say 4 days, now usually that's not something that's going to occur within a commercial lab. But these are things that I think are important to consider in the relative relationships between soil moisture status and K availability, what we measure in the lab. Are there scenarios then in this case where in-season potassium is beneficial? Well, we did some research when I was in Wisconsin to look at this. Again, we were looking at soils probably fairly similar to, we'll say Saybrook, Illinois, and north in the part of the state. What we did was we looked at in-season, we'll call them side dress. It was applied to corn and soybean, potassium acetate in this case. And really what we saw was only a benefit when we were in a low testing soil. So around 130 parts per million or 260 pounds per acre was the optimum soil test K level in this case for these soils. And in general, we only saw a yield response to in-season fertilization of K when we had a low enough soil test K level. And it was a little more clear for corn than it was for soybean. This was a summary of that data when we looked at the yield responses across soil test levels. So there was benefit to applying in-season K, but it really was driven by those low soil test K, those low soil test K soils. So one thing that's important to think about, there's really no rescue treatment for when we start to see K deficiencies. But if you're in a scenario where you have the ability to put in-season K on that you maybe are renting ground that you hadn't soil sampled yet, or something like that where you needed to get some K on, there are some in-season options. I'll put a warning out there though that these do sometimes require fairly high water carrying load or carrier load for water on, let's say, saddle tanks or something like that. Depends on your application system, but you really can't push the threshold when applying K. It's really just something like a removal value. A few quick slides on spring nitrogen management for wheat. So a reminder that the general way that we've been interpreting the optimum N rate for wheat as we're applying in the spring, either in 1 or 2 shots, maybe 3 shots, is looking at the amount of nitrogen that's bought by 1 bushel of wheat. And so in general, with current prices, we're about at that 11 pounds of nitrogen. So you can see that number would kind of be bordering it, and it kind of ranges between 9 and 11. So we're within that medium to high range here when we think about the amount of N that probably makes sense to apply on our wheat crop. And I know price margins are fairly tough with wheat right now, and so if we can optimize inputs, that certainly has a lot of benefits. When we look at the wheat conditions, again, this is changing daily essentially right now within the wheat crop and physiology and crop development. But in general, planting conditions in the fall were fairly ideal in a lot of parts of the state, depending on really how delayed maybe let's say your soybeans were planting in the spring prior, and then when your soybeans were coming off, for example. Corn harvest certainly came out really fast, and so that may be beneficial for getting the wheat in. It certainly was dry, I think, in a lot of cases when the wheat was getting planted last fall. This is just a summary of some data that I had done in Wisconsin. I think was kind of interesting when we looked at different measurements or diagnostic tools to inform an optimum N rate and then the yield of that N rate for winter wheat. What this is looking at are different measurements and how those affected your ability to predict the EONR, optimum N rate, and the yield at that optimum N rate. And in general, it really was not super surprising that planting date had a large effect on this. We showed this as growing degree days from planting to green up, but really it's demonstrating planting date. But there also was a relationship between the amount of soil nitrogen in the upper 2 foot of the soil profile at green up. And then we looked at the relationships of some of these measurements with yield. We saw that there were some usefulness of canopy sensing. The problem is it really always wasn't in a time when we were able to get our N on as early as we wanted to. And this may change as we move farther south. So we'll be taking some of these measurements as we go forward. We do have some wheat and double crop systems research that's put out already last fall, and looking to expand that. This is a picture taken last weekend in Piatt County, and you can just see the differences within the spring green up, where I would say green up rates, or we can talk about growth rates a little bit later. We're taking crop canopy measurements. Eventually, obviously, we'll measure yield. just the visual effect of whether there was fall N applied either as directly as nitrogen or with the phosphorus application strategy. A last slide in terms of data and information, and that's revolving sulfur. Certainly when we think about sulfur programs and fertilization programs, I think it's always kind of omnipresent in a lot of people's minds. I certainly get quite a few questions on them. One of the things that we certainly already understand is that sulfur wet deposition is decreasing. We do see an increase in low testing soils for sulfur. Now the problem is that the sulfur soil test really does not inform much for fertilization response, yield levels, or anything like that. This is some data from the North American Soil Test Summary, which I was a part of. And we're actually doing the next rendition of that right now for 2025. This is for Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Ohio. The percent of samples within these specific years where the samples were testing below 7 parts per million. So we did see an increasing trend. I think I've seen some data from directly from Indiana that confirms this a little bit in terms of looking at lab information and trends. And so unsurprisingly, we were maybe seeing less amount of sulfate sulfur within our soils because of wet deposition, but the struggle is really trying to predict what sites and fields will see responses. So rely on confirming those deficiencies and target those fields if we can. Probably have to target them annually or with applications that make sense in your crop rotation. These are some on-farm research efforts that we've got going on in my lab in collaboration around the state. We're working with IFCA and Dan Schaefer and John Pike and looking at the on-farm corn N rate trials, wanting to really expand those to make sure that we're representing the state well and kind of taking an aggressive approach to that. It's a lot of fun in that planning phase right now, and we're starting to get all those trials out in 2025. Certainly, if you're still interested, please contact me. We can talk about fitting something in maybe in next year, or if you feel like squeezing something in this year, that would work as well. Some other topics that we're hitting on with on-farm research are soil test P and K calibration and spatial variability, precision nitrogen management. We're looking at interactions between corn response to nitrogen and sulfur and potassium separately, but these trials are will be going on in 2025. And then I mentioned the winter wheat soybean N rate trials that are looking at also P source and sulfur source. Here's my contact information. I think overall, when we think about going into 2025, we're not really sure what's going to happen yet in terms of soil moisture and N supply. I think we've seen some pretty big fluctuations. One of the things that seems fairly present when we think about the consistency of N response timing is that making sure that we've got at least subsequent enough nitrogen, whether that's 40, 50, 60 pounds of N, whether it's 25 to 30 or 40% of your total N budget or N rate is getting on fairly early in the season. I think that's really shown to pay off in a lot of Dr. Nafsinger's work. Again, thanks for your time. I appreciate it today. Here's my contact information on the screen, and please feel free to give me a shout if I can ever be of use. Look forward to meeting you around the state.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jones, for being with us today. Again, I appreciate you coming on and giving your thoughts on what you see going into the spring. Also, as he pointed out at the end, if you would like to do an N-rate trial with one of your farmers or a retailer wants to do it, please let us know. The more data we have, the better that data is. And we can still try and work on those N-rate trials from right now. Again, Dr. Jones, thank you so much. Few things I wanted to add to the end, and then we'll wrap this up. And I just want everybody to have a safe spring this coming spring. Is July 24th. We will have our IFCA golf outing at the Den in Bloomington. The Maggie Show will be August 20th and 21st here at McLean County Fairgrounds. And then lastly, we always put on a 4R field day here in the state of Illinois. Dan Schaefer does an excellent job. That date will be September 4th. At Eric Miller's farm again in Hammond, Illinois. So please mark those on your calendars. We will have more information. We're going to try and get Dr. Hager on here to talk about going into the 25 crop on herbicides, but also talk about the Endangered Species Act and some of those issues. So again, Dr. Jones, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you guys here soon, and have a safe spring, guys.